So welcome to the respiratory system for lab. So if we were actually in lab, we would be using some models, and here are the models that we would be using. So if you take a look at this, this model is basically just a general model of the respiratory system, and these are just pulled out models, and we're going to take a look at all of them. But before we do that, let's talk about the respiratory system just a little bit. So if you look at the respiratory system, we can classify the respiratory system into different parts. And there's actually two classification systems, two ways to classify it. One is an anatomical classification system. And so if you should remember that anatomy is all about structure. And so if we use the anatomical classification system, it's basically two divisions. And we get an upper respiratory division or upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory division or a lower respiratory tract. Well, the dividing line is the larynx. And so if you can find your Adam's apple, so you can feel the front of your throat and find your Adam's apple, that is the larynx, and that's the dividing line. So anything above the Adam's apple is considered upper respiratory. The Adam's apple, the larynx, and below is considered lower respiratory. It's kind of an artificial system, but it gives us a way to talk about things. And so if you happen to have a sinus infection or something like that, it's above the larynx, and so it's an upper respiratory infection. But if you happen to have something like pneumonia or bronchitis, it's below the larynx, and so lower respiratory infection. Another way to do a classification system, though, is based on function. And so it's a physiological classification system. And so if you think about what the respiratory system is mostly all about, it's all about gas exchange. And so there's a part of the respiratory system where gas exchange takes place, and then there's a part where it doesn't. And so we also have two divisions here. Now these are called zones, but one is called the conducting zone. So the conducting zone has no gas exchange at all. It's basically just a bunch of pipes. And so if you think about the conducting zone, it starts here. There's no gas exchange here, there's no gas exchange here, there's none here, there's none here. It's not until you get way, 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 way deep into the lungs that we start getting gas exchange. If you go down in there, what you're going to find are little tiny sacs. They're called alveoli. And it's not until we get down to this area that we start getting gas exchange. And so that zone is called the respiratory zone. I think it's a better way of designating it, but they're both useful. But let's talk a little bit more about this respiratory system. Humans actually don't have a very efficient respiratory system. And the reason why is because it's a one-way system. The air comes in, goes around in here, we do our thing, and then it goes back out. But it's never truly empty. There's always air in here. And so there's old air in here, air from the previous breath. And so when the new air comes in, it has to mix with this old air. And so we don't get the benefit of this brand new air because it's this mixture of air, a mix of old and new. We're actually really lucky that we live on a planet with a lot of oxygen. Our planet has about 21% oxygen in the air. If we lived in a place where there was less oxygen, we would have a hard time getting enough oxygen into our systems. It even happens when we climb mountains. So as you go up in altitude, the air becomes thinner and thinner and thinner. And so as you climb the mountain, there's less and less air. And so when you get to a certain height, there's just not enough air, not enough oxygen for us to breathe. Well, some other animals are quite good good at breathing at this level. So if you look at, say, birds, birds can fly over mountains. They can actually fly over mountains and breathe this high altitude air because birds have a more efficient respiratory system than humans do. So you could even be flying in an airplane. If you fly in an airplane, they fly like 35,000 feet, which is very, very high. Well, no human can really breathe at 35,000 feet. And so we pressurize our airplanes. We pump air into them so that we can breathe. But you could look out your window and you could see a bird out here flying. So there's a bird out there like a goose or something flying at the same level that you are when you fly in an airplane. So here is a model, and look, we talked about the conducting zone. This shows you the conducting zone here. So it starts here, but it goes all the way down. And then here's this respiratory zone. So that again is where we're going to get gas exchange. And so it's a blow up of these tiny, tiny little structures that we find down in the lungs. Well, in order for us to breathe, the first thing we have to do is we have to get air into and out of our lungs. Now, if you remember from the lecture, that's called ventilation. And ventilation depends on a gas law. It depends on Boyle's law. And so what Boyle's law says is that pressure and volume are related to each other. And if one goes up, the other automatically goes down. We also should remember that air flows, and air flows from high pressure to low pressure. Think about a balloon that you filled up with air, and then you let go of the balloon. The air is going to rush out because air moves from high pressure to low pressure. And so we can make air move in and out just by altering this pressure. Now, the easiest way to alter the pressure is by altering the volume of the container. And so that's exactly what we do. And we use muscles to do it. So we have these muscles of inspiration. And the muscles of inspiration, there's two sets of these. One of these is the diaphragm. Another one is the external intercostals. So those are the muscles of inspiration. And the way they work is they make the chest bigger. So what happens with the diaphragm is sort of shaped like a parachute. So here's the diaphragm in its relaxed state. But what happens when it contracts is it flattens out. And as it flattens out, it makes the chest longer. So the chest gets longer. We've increased the volume of the chest. And when you increase the volume, automatically the pressure is going to go down. The same thing happens with the muscles that are between the ribs. There are muscles here that lift the ribs out like this. They lift the ribs out. And that muscle makes the chest wider. So, wider chest, we've also increased the volume. And again, when you do that, you're going to decrease the pressure. Those muscles are these external intercostals. And so they lift the ribs this way. They lift it out. So the muscles of inspiration are the diaphragm. And here's the diaphragm. Now the red part is muscle. The white part is a central tendon. So muscle contracts. It pulls down on this tendon. And that's why we go from this shape to more of a flattened shape. Here are the external intercostals. And again, they're going to raise the ribs and make the chest cavity wider. So if we look at this model, we can see these external intercostals. And if you look blow it up, they look like this. These are the external intercostals. We also have muscles which are called muscles of expiration. And muscles of expiration, what they do is they allow us to force air out. And the way it works is exactly the same way it works on Boyle's law. But what's going to happen here is we're going to increase the pressure in the chest. And if you increase the pressure in the chest above the outside, air is going to flow out. Well, again, we're going to do that, but we're going to decrease the volume. And so what these internal intercostals do, they pull the chest inward. And so they're going to pull the ribs inward like this. And what's going to happen is the chest is going to get narrower. So the chest is going to be pulled in this direction, and it's going to get narrower. So again, we're going to decrease the volume. Automatically, we're going to increase the pressure. And remember, air flows from high pressure to low pressure. So air is going to flow out. We also have another set of muscles that have to do with that, and these are the abdominal muscles. So the way the abdominals work is they squeeze the abdomen. And if you squeeze the abdomen, what happens is the organs that are on the inside of the abdomen, the stomach, the intestines, and so on, they squeeze in, they get pushed up. Those organs get pushed up against the diaphragm, and they force the diaphragm up into the chest cavity further than it usually is. And so it's going to make the chest cavity shorter. And so again, we're going to decrease the volume. That automatically is going to increase the pressure, and air is going to flow out. So if we look at all of those muscles, here's the diaphragm. Here's the internal and external intercostals, and they fit on top of each other. External like this, internal like this. You can see that in this picture here, and especially in this one. So external fits on top, internal underneath like that. And here are those internals. In this picture, you can see both of them, and you can see how these fibers are running this way and how these fibers are running this way. So these pull the ribs this way, these pull the ribs this way. And then here are our abdominal muscles, and if you remember from A&P1, there are 4 abdominal muscles. So we have a rectus abdominis, we have 2 obliques, an internal and an external, and we have the transverse abdominis. So if we look at those, here's the rectus. Here is the internal and external oblique. There's the external. And then here is internal. And then here is the transverse abdominis. And all of these are going to compress or constrict the abdomen. And again, it's going to force the diaphragm further up into the chest. So that's how we get air to move in and out. So let's talk about where it goes. So the first place air goes is in the nose. Well, if you look at the nose, there are 2 little nasal bones. But there's also cartilage, hyaline cartilage, and also dense connective tissue. That's what gives our nose its shape. We have what we think of as nostrils. They're openings. There are 2 of these. They're technically called the external nares. And you can see those here. Here are the external nares. Well, just inside, there are hairs here. And those hairs are there to block out particles. They block out particulate matter so that you don't breathe it in. And so they block things like dust and stuff like that. From the nose, we go into the nasal cavity. So here's the nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity has more than one function. This is where our olfactory receptors are. So this is where our sense of smell comes from. But it also has a mucous membrane in here. And this mucous membrane is very warm, and it's also sticky. It's got mucus, and it's also wet. And so the air that comes in here is going to come into contact with this mucous membrane. Well, the more the air comes into contact with the mucous membrane, the more that we can clean the air, and the more that we can warm the air up, and the more that we can hydrate the air. So this whole upper respiratory tract is kind of like a huge air conditioning system, because we want the air to be clean. We want to remove all of the particles. Remember, there's no exit. We also want to hydrate it because the tissues in here are very delicate and dry air would damage them. And we also want to warm it up because cold air would also damage them. And so when the air comes in here, it doesn't just flow straight through. It swirls like crazy in here. Well, that's easier to see if you look at this picture. Look at what this looks like. So here's the air coming in here. And look at it. There are these curlicue-like structures. These are called conchae. And the air has to flow across those curlicues. And so the air swirls. It creates turbulence in the air. And so the air is going to come into contact with this warm, wet surface. So when you look at those, they're called conchae. And the word conch is a seashell. So they look a little bit like seashells. Collectively, they're called turbinates because they create turbulence in the air. And look, there are three of these. If we go back to this picture, we can see those three right here. So we have a superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. There's the superior, there's the middle, there's the inferior. If we look on our model, we can see the same thing. So if we go to the model, we'll see a superior, a middle, and an inferior nasal concha. And again, remember they're shaped like curlicues, like this. And so they create this turbulence. Not only are there these conchae, but there are also tunnels where air goes through. The tunnels are called meatuses. So there's a superior meatus, a middle meatus, and an inferior meatus. And if we follow the meatuses back here to the end of these conchae, we get to what are called the internal nares. And the internal nares is the other boundary of the nasal cavity. So it goes from the external to the internal. Another thing you should remember is that the nose is divided in half, and so we have this nasal septum. It's a wall right here in the middle. The top part of this, remember, is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. The bottom part is the vomer, and that's what makes up this nasal septum. Well, you can't see the nasal septum in this model because it's been removed. You can see these conchae, and remember collectively they're called the turbinates. We also have sinuses. And remember, sinuses are hollow air-filled spaces in bone, and they're connected to the nasal cavity. So air can move through the nasal cavity into and out of these sinuses. Sinuses have more than one function. One thing they do is they make the skull lighter, so it's not quite as heavy. They also act like a resonating chamber, sort of like a guitar body. If you think about the strings on a guitar, if there's no body, they don't make very much sound. But when they resonate on the sound, it's louder. And that's what happens with our voice. So it has us to resonate the sound. Remember, the sinuses are named for the bone they're located in. So we have frontal sinuses, they're in the frontal bone, ethmoid sinuses in the ethmoid bone, sphenoid, and maxillary. The maxillary ones are the largest ones, and they're in the maxilla. Now, they don't show up on this model because the maxillae have been removed, but you can see these others. So there's our front sinus, there's one of the ethmoid sinuses, there's a couple of the sphenoid sinuses. The maxillary sinus would be right here, but that actually has been removed when you do the section. You can see this maxillary sinus, though, on this model. And so it's behind this. It's inside the maxilla. You can also see the frontal. You can also see the sphenoid. And if you look at a real cadaver, you can also see these sinuses here. So you can see that. There's the frontal sinus. There's the sphenoid sinus. And look how closely this model matches the cadaver. So the model that we're using is very, very lifelike. Now, these don't really have to do with the respiratory system, but remember we also have tonsils here. And there's a pair of tonsils up here in the pharynx. Those are the pharyngeal tonsils. And then remember there's two pair of tonsils in the oral cavity. That's the palatine and lingual. Well, the reason they're there, if you remember, they're part of this lymphatic system. They're lymphoid tissues, and they have high concentration of white blood cells. And so these white blood cells are in a place where air is going to go through, or food or liquid is going to go through. Well, the air we breathe and the food and liquid we eat is not sterile. It's got tons of bacteria and stuff on it. And so all of those bacteria then have to cross, or viruses have to cross these tonsils in order to get in. And so it can help us keep ourselves from getting sick. So that's the nasal cavity. Again, from the external nares to the internal nares. From there, though, we go into this tube. And we already talked about this when we talked about digestion. This is the pharynx. And if you remember when we did digestion, the pharynx is divided up into three parts. So we have the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx should only receive air. So air comes in here, but there should not be any food or liquid up in here. And so the tissue here is very, very thin. The tissue here, and also the tissue in the nasal cavity, is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So it's only one cell layer thick. But down here, in the oropharynx and in the laryngopharynx, the tissue is stratified squamous. And so it's a much thicker tissue and a much less likely to be perforated tissue as food moves across it. It resists abrasion. Well, we can see that on the model here too. So remember, there's our external, here's our internal, and then here's the pharynx right here. And so again, we can divide this up into three parts: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. You should also remember there's an opening right here that the food and liquid goes through, and air, to get into the pharynx. That's called the fauces. The nasal cavity is divided from the oral cavity, and we learn this with digestion by the hard palate. Remember, the reason it's called hard is because there's bone here. And the soft palate. This is not bone, it's muscle and fat and mucous membrane. Well, the soft palate is soft because it has a function. And its function is when you swallow, it closes off the entrance up into the nasal cavity. It's reflected this direction. And so food, when you swallow it, can't go this way. It can only go this way. Another thing that we saw in the nasopharynx is right here are the openings to the auditory tubes. So when we did the ear, remember there's a tube that goes to the middle ear, the auditory tube, and it equalizes the pressure in the middle ear. Another thing we have here is this little hanging down like structure here, which is part of the soft palate. That is called uvula. Now, some people think this has something to do with voice, but it does not. It has nothing to do with voice. It's just part of this thing that closes this off when you swallow. So here's the soft palate, and there's the uvula. Well, air, when it goes down, is supposed to go this way. But remember, food and air are both moving down here. Well, if food gets in here, it's very difficult to get it out. And so the next structure, one of its jobs is to prevent that from happening. And that structure is the larynx. So the larynx has three jobs. One is to make sure you have an open airway. And it's open all the time unless you're swallowing. The second one is it provides a switching mechanism to keep food out of the respiratory tract. And then the third one, this is where our vocal cords are, so this is where voice production happens. Well, if you look at the larynx, it's made out of cartilages. And there are 9 cartilages, 9 of them. There are 3 that are paired, so that makes 6. And then 3 more that are single, and so that makes 9. Well, let's look at the single ones first. So if you look at this picture, you can see an anterior view and a posterior view. Well, the largest of the cartilages are the single ones. The very largest one is called the thyroid cartilage because right here is the thyroid gland. So the thyroid cartilage is this one. It's sort of shield shaped. And like a shield, it doesn't go all the way around. Look, it only comes to here. It doesn't go all the way to the back. The second largest cartilage is this one. It's called the cricoid. And the cricoid is kind of small in the front, but it's much bigger in the back. And it does go all the way around. It's a complete circle. And then the third one that's single is this one right here. And if you look at it, it looks sort of tongue-shaped. That is the epiglottis. And it's the job of the epiglottis to close off the opening to the respiratory system when you swallow. So here's a real one. And we can see these cartilages, and there's the epiglottis right there. If we go back to our model, it looks like this. And here's the epiglottis right here. So back here is where the esophagus is. So food comes down like this. And then what happens is this epiglottis will fold down. It'll fold down like this. And it almost forms like a slide. And the food sort of slides past it into the esophagus. And then as soon as you stop swallowing, it pops back open again so that we can have this open airway. If we go back to this picture here, you can see it right here. And so, again, there it is right there. And here comes the food this way. It folds down like this so that the food slides in this direction into the esophagus. And then it pops back open again to provide this open airway. So, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, epiglottis. We also, though, have 3 smaller cartilages that are paired. This is one of them right here. This is called the arytenoid cartilage. And right on the end of it is an even smaller pointy one. Looks sort of like a pair of horns. This is called the corniculate cartilage. And then the third one here, which is wedge-shaped, is the cuneiform cartilages. So, a total of 9 cartilages. Now, if you're down here, this is not the larynx. That is the trachea. We're going to talk about it next. But look, it also has cartilages. Same kind of material. All of these cartilages are made out of hyaline cartilage, except for the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is elastic cartilage. But all of the others are hyaline cartilage. Any questions? So here's a model of the larynx. Now this is not cartilage right here, that's bone. That's the hyoid bone. But there's our thyroid cartilage, there's the cricoid cartilage. Remember, this is actually the trachea. So those are tracheal cartilages, you see. If we flip it around and look at the back side of it, it looks like this. That's still the thyroid, and that's still the cricoid. And there is the epiglottis right there. In this picture, we can also see the smaller cartilages. So there's the arytenoid, there's the corniculate, and there, which you can't see really, are the cuneiforms. If we open it up and look at it medially, it's like this. So, again, we can see these cartilages. There's our thyroid. There's the cricoid. Remember, it's larger in the back than it is in the front. Now, the others are right here, and they're not visible. But that one is our epiglottis. You can also, in this picture, see the vocal cords. So the vocal cords are actually ligaments. And that's what they're called, vocal ligaments. Here's the vocal cord right here. Now there's 2 of them, but the other one's on the other half of the model. Sometimes these are called true vocal cords or vocal ligaments. We also have this right here, which sort of protects, keeps air from moving on the wrong side. Sometimes these are called false vocal cords, but technically they're called the ventricular folds. The false vocal cords, the ventricular folds, don't have anything to do with voice production. Here's another model. Again, there's our true vocal cords. There's our false vocal cords. Here's another model. You can see the same thing. There's the true ones. There's the false ones. There's our epiglottis right there. So that's the larynx. Any questions about the larynx? Well, from the larynx, we're going to go into the trachea. The trachea is going to come down here like this. So here is the trachea right here. Sometimes the trachea is called the windpipe, and that's basically what it is. It's just a pipe. And the air is going to get piped down in here. Remember, air flows from high pressure to low pressure. So when we breathe in, there's a low pressure here, and it sucks air in this way. When we breathe out, there's a high pressure here, and air's forced out this way. If we look at the trachea, we can see it here. If we pull that up, it looks like this. So there's our trachea. And remember, these are tracheal cartilages. Again, they're made out of hyaline cartilage. Well, at the bottom end of the trachea, it's going to split. And right where this split happens is a special little place called the carina. And the carina has tons of nerve endings. And so if you get food or liquid down into the trachea, especially if it goes down this far, what's going to happen is you're going to activate those nerve endings like crazy, and you're going to cough and cough and cough until whatever it is removed from these nerve endings. You can also see the split right here. And when it splits, we get what are called bronchi. So here is the first bronchus. So the first bronchus is called the primary bronchus, and there are two of these. So we have a right primary bronchus and a left primary bronchus. But look, they're going to split again. And when they split the next time, this is the second split, secondary bronchi, secondary bronchi. And then they're going to split again, and we're going to get tertiary bronchi. And then they're going to split again and again and again and again. If you count how many times they split, it's 23 times. Every time they split, they get smaller. But there's our trachea, and here's our primary, there's the secondary, and then these are tertiary. We can also see that on this model. And here are the keys. You can use this to test yourself if you want. But we can also see it on this model. So look, there's the trachea. You can see the tracheal cartilages here. There's our carina, right where it splits. And then look, we're going to see this bronchus, and then it's going to split and we'll see this, and then it's going to split and we'll see this. So we're going to have the primary bronchi, secondary and tertiary bronchi. And again, it's going to keep splitting 23 times. Now we're inside the lungs. Let's look at the lungs. First of all, if you look at the lungs, they're pointy at the top. That's called the apex. And they're flat at the bottom. And that's called the base. The two lungs are not the same size. The right lung is bigger and the left lung is smaller. And the reason for that is because of the position of the heart. So remember, the heart is not in the center of the chest. It's 2/3 to the left of center. And so that means that there's less space on the left side. And so we wind up with a smaller lung. The right lung, it's bigger. It has 3 lobes to it, whereas the left lung, smaller, only has 2 lobes to it. What separates the lobes are called fissures. So fissures are deep grooves. So we have 2 fissures on the right side, but only 1 fissure on the left side. Well, look at the direction of these fissures. These run diagonally. So they're called obliques. So there's an oblique on both sides. But this one just runs basically straight across, and so it's called the horizontal fissure. So these are real lungs. So there's our apex up there. Here's the base down here. Here's our 3 lobes on this side, our only 2 lobes over here. There's a fissure on this side, the oblique. There's the oblique on this side. But here's the horizontal on this side. We can see the same thing on the model. If we open up the model, you can still see fissures in here. That's how deep they are. And again, remember, it's going to divide it up into lobes. So this right lung has 3 lobes. Now this picture's kind of messed up, but you can still see the fissures, and you can see the 3 lobes over here. Well, if you look in here, these light blue things that you see, those are bronchi. These red things are arteries, and these blue things are veins. And so there's a whole lot of that running through there. There's this heart. Again, it's 2/3 to the left of center. And so the space that it fits in is sort of a cutout on the left lung, and it's called a cardiac notch. Over here you can see more bronchi, and you can see more arteries and more veins. So, looks something like that. Not only that, but remember there are membranes around the lung. Serous membranes. So remember, the serous membranes are double layered membranes. And so we can see 2 layers, one right there and one right there. One layer is touching the lung. That one is the visceral layer. And one layer is not touching the lung. That's the parietal layer. And then there's a space in between, the cavity. So we can see all 3 of those things. Well, remember, these membranes are called pleura. So we have a visceral pleura, a parietal pleura, and a pleural cavity. We can also sort of see it on this model. So if you look here, the lung looks spongy. And if I blow it up, you'll be able to see it better. But over here, it looks shiny. So the shiny part is not the lung. It's these membranes. So if we blow it up here, look, there's the lung. It looks spongy. But look here, that is not the lung. That is the visceral pleura. And that is not the lung. That's the parietal pleura. And then that white line that's between the 2, that's that pleural cavity. So if we go back to this picture, we should be able to pick it out. Don't forget, the heart has the same situation. So if we look at the heart, we're going to have the parietal and visceral pericardium. So with the lungs, we're going to have the parietal and visceral pleura. Well, if we follow the bronchi down into the lungs, they keep dividing, and keep dividing. Remember, we have cartilage. So when you look here at this blue, that's cartilage. But the deeper you go into the lung, the less cartilage there is, until you get to some point where there's no cartilage. Well, when you get to the point where there's no cartilage, we don't call them bronchi anymore. Now they're called bronchioles. So all of these are bronchioles. And bronchioles look like this. Now they're still pipes, they're still tubes, but they don't have any cartilage around them. What they do have around them is smooth muscle. But the bronchi continue to, the bronchioles continue to divide and get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. But there's no gas exchange until we get right here. After that, there is gas exchange. And the last bronchiole, where there's no gas exchange, is called the terminal bronchiole. So there's our terminal bronchiole. So that's the very end of the conducting zone. And then the next bronchiole that we have is called the respiratory bronchiole. And that's these right here. And they are the beginning of the respiratory zone. And the respiratory zone includes the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. Looks like this. So there's that terminal bronchiole. So right there's the end of the conducting zone. And there's our respiratory bronchiole. So that's the beginning of the respiratory zone. And again, the respiratory zone is the respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. So if you look at alveoli, look at them, they look like hollow grapes. And they have blood vessels wrapped around them. So where the blood vessel comes in close contact with the air in this alveolus, that's where we're going to get gas exchange. So if we look on the model, we can see the same thing. So right there's the end of the conducting zone and the beginning of the respiratory zone and our respiratory bronchioles. We also have alveolar ducts and alveoli. Well, if you look at this, alveoli look a lot like grapes. So one alveolus is like one grape. But these are just like grapes in that they sort of come in groups. And so one group of alveoli is called an alveolar sac. But in here is where air is, and there's blood vessels right there. And so this is where we're going to get gas exchange. And if we blow up even more, they look like this. So here are those hollow grape-like structures, those alveoli. And right here are the blood vessels. So look, where blood comes into contact with air in this hollow space, that's where we're going to get gas exchange. And if we blow that up even more, it looks like this. So here's where the air is, and there's where the blood is. And where they come in close contact is where we're going to get gas exchange. Remember, there's about 300 million of these in each lung. And so the amount of surface area right here is huge. If I were to flatten out all of these alveoli, just take them and unfold them and flatten them out and put them side by side, end to end, the space is about the size of a doubles tennis court. That's how much surface area there is in our lungs. So that's the anatomy of the respiratory system. Well, remember we started this whole process with ventilation, with air going in and out. Well, we can measure how much air goes in and out and get an idea of lung capacities. We do that with a machine that looks like this. So this is where you breathe right here. And as you breathe, this thing goes up and down, and this moves, and we can measure how much it moves, and we can produce a graph as we breathe in and out, and so on. This graph is called the spirometer, and what we get are a bunch of different volumes, and these volumes can be measured. So in a normal, quiet breath, people breathe like this, in, out, in, out, in, out. It's sort of like the tide going in and out. So it's called the tidal volume. But everybody in here already knows you can breathe in more and you can breathe out more than a normal, plain, quiet breath. And so look at what we get. Here's the tidal volume. Here's the amount you can breathe in above the tidal volume. That's called the inspiratory reserve volume. Here's the amount you can blow out past the tidal volume. That's the expiratory reserve volume. If we add those three together, we get a max breath in followed by a max breath out. And that is called the vital capacity. The vital capacity. So that's as much air as you can possibly take in, followed by as much air as you can possibly blow out. But no matter how hard you try, you cannot blow all the air out of your lungs. There's some air that stays in your lungs, even after a maximum breath. That is called the residual volume. So if we add the residual volume to the vital capacity, we're going to get the total lung capacity. In other words, exactly how much air your lungs can hold. So what I'd like you to be able to do is label a graph like this. I'd also like you to know what all these things mean. Now, if you notice there are numbers here, you don't have to know the numbers. They vary anyway, depending on your age, your body size, your gender, and so on. There is one number, though, that I want you to remember, and that's this one, because it does not change very much. Even if you're male versus female, young or old, it doesn't change very much. But here are some of those averages. So males tend to have larger chests than females, and so they tend to have bigger lungs. And so if you look at all these numbers for a male versus all these numbers for a female, basically all of them are bigger. This is bigger. This is bigger. But this one, remember, does not really change very much. So the tidal volume for an adult, whether you're male or female, is about 500 milliliters of air, about half a liter of air. And again, breathe in, we breathe out, we breathe in, we breathe out, about half a liter of air. So make sure you're able to label the graph, make sure you know the definitions of each of these volumes. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming, and I'll see you next time.